Welcome to Metabolic Entanglement. This is the first in a series of videos on metabolic syndrome. It took me a long time to decide where to start, but I realized that if I don't explain what is the problem, I can't explain anything else. So in this video, we will talk about what is metabolic syndrome, what are the medical standards for diagnosis and treatment of the syndrome, why are they like that, and why some of them are so unsuccessful. Let's start with the fact that metabolic syndrome is the most common disease in the world. The statistics are terrifying because 25% of the world's population, or 1 in 4 people, already has been diagnosed with metabolic syndrome. What's worse is that most of the cases are undiagnosed, and it is estimated that more than 50% of the world's population has metabolic syndrome to one degree or another. The other frightful fact is that metabolic syndrome is the main cause of over 90% of all degenerative diseases and costs more human lives and suffering than any other disease. So, if you have metabolic syndrome, you have a serious problem, but if you don't know you have it, your problem is even bigger. That's why we will try to find the answer to 3 very important questions. What is metabolic syndrome? Why more than half of the cases of the syndrome are not detected? And why and how metabolic syndrome causes more than 90% of all degenerative diseases? So, let's start with the first question. What is metabolic syndrome? Unfortunately, there is no quick and easy answer. Everything is so entangled and so complicated that since it was discovered in 1921, metabolic syndrome received many names and many definitions. The most common name is metabolic syndrome, but is also often called prediabetes. The newest name it has is insulin resistance syndrome, but you can also find it as syndrome X, dysmetabolic syndrome, and Raven's syndrome. If we take a close look at the names, we will see that the only thing they have in common is the word syndrome. So in order to understand what is metabolic syndrome, we need to know what syndrome is. And syndrome, as a medical term, is a condition described by a group of symptoms that have the same origin. For all syndromes, it's typical that if one or more of their symptoms are detected, then all the other symptoms can be easily predicted. Or, in other words, a syndrome must have more than one symptom, and those symptoms must have a common origin, a common cause. Respectively, metabolic syndrome is a disease that has a group of symptoms with the same origin, and those symptoms are linked to metabolism. Or simply said, we have a group of metabolic symptoms with a common origin. But this is not the official definition. Here is where the fun part begins, because there is no official definition. If you take a look at the article on metabolic syndrome at Wikipedia, you will see that most major health organizations have their own definitions. Those definitions are very close to each other and have the same format. To be diagnosed with metabolic syndrome, the patient must have at least 3 of the 5 symptoms that describe the syndrome. The most common definition includes the following 5 symptoms: obesity in the central part of the body, or just being overweight in some definitions, high blood pressure, high blood sugar, high levels of triglycerides, and low levels of high-density lipoprotein, the so-called good cholesterol. The main difference in the definitions is that in some of them, high blood sugar is replaced with insulin resistance. But either way, all the definitions are stating that to have metabolic syndrome, you must have at least 3 of the 5 symptoms. However, what they don't tell us is what causes the syndrome. And this is so because there are different views on what causes metabolic syndrome. The current views are divided into two main camps. The first camp includes about 80% of the medical community and the most major health organizations. They are the so-called status quo of medicine. Their view on metabolic syndrome is that metabolic syndrome is a degenerative, progressive, incurable disease of unclear origin. And let me translate. Degenerative means destructive, damaging, and progressive means that it gets worse over time. So, they believe that metabolic syndrome is a damaging, incurable disease that gets worse over time, and they are not sure what causes it. But they hypothesize that metabolic syndrome is caused by obesity, driven by excessive food consumption and lack of physical activity, or in other words, too many calories in and not enough calories out. In addition, they assume that factors such as age, race, genes, and the typical suspects fat, salt, sugar, alcohol, and cigarettes contribute to metabolic syndrome development. Because they perceive the syndrome as an incurable disease, it is also believed that the only thing we can do is to stop it or at least to slow it down. The hypothesis that obesity is the main cause of metabolic syndrome leads to the following treatment: calorie restriction diet and physical activity, or in other words, less calories in and more calories out. And if necessary, the symptoms of the syndrome can be treated with drugs. Generally speaking, Camp 1 claims that metabolic syndrome is obesity. Unlike Camp 1, people in Camp 2 believe that metabolic syndrome has a different cause. They perceive the syndrome as a reversible disease that is a result of adaptive physiology, where the body adapts to something. They think that this adaptation is driven by chronically high insulin combined with insulin resistance, the inability of the body to respond properly to normal amount of insulin. They think that chronically high insulin and insulin resistance are caused by excessive sugar consumption, excessive consumption of ultra-processed foods, and chronic stress. That's why they believe that metabolic syndrome can be reversed by insulin-lowering diet, physical activity, and stress control. If we have to summarize, so far we have many names, many definitions, and two main camps with two different hypotheses on metabolic syndrome: obesity and insulin resistance. And the question is, who is right? But before we get to the answer, let me first tell you my story. I was told that I have metabolic syndrome about 20 years ago. It all began with a routine appointment. My blood tests were not good, and my doctor sent me for further tests in the endocrine clinic. After 3 days of full and thorough check, I was informed that I had no thyroid problems or any other serious disease, and that I just have metabolic syndrome. I was told that I have it because I ate more than I need to, and because I had sedentary lifestyle. They said that being overweight is what causes the syndrome. So to avoid diabetes, I was advised to lose weight, to eat less and to exercise more. I was told to avoid fat, salt and sugar, and to eat more fruits, vegetables, whole grain foods and lean meats. I was reminded once more to stop smoking and to cut down on alcohol, and I was left to tackle my metabolic syndrome on my own. But the fact that I have metabolic syndrome didn't scare me. If anything, I even felt relief, because I've always been overweight. At this point in my life, I was about 275 pounds, and based on my height and body structure, I had an extra 55 pounds. Being fat was not something new for me. I was the same weight for the last 10 years, but I was also young, tall, strong, and quite active. I didn't felt like I have a disease, I felt completely normal. Yes, I tried to lose weight, but I didn't succeed. And as life goes on, I forgot that I have metabolic syndrome. During the first 5, 6 years after my diagnosis, nothing changed. I kept the same weight, and I was still feeling good. You can see me in the picture, I look normal. Of course, you can't see my belly because back then I was always hiding it for photos. After I passed 33, I started slowly but surely to gain weight. I tried different diets, I tried slimming pills, I've been a member of many gyms. I even worked in one for almost 3 years. But despite all of my efforts, I didn't manage to lose weight. And even if I had some success, it was only temporary. And for those people who will say that I was lacking willpower and that I didn't try it hard enough, I will tell the next story. When I passed 340 pounds for the first time, I've got so pissed off that I began extreme diet and exercise. I promised myself that I won't stop until I look and feel like a normal person again. So for almost 8 months, I ate just once a day, and I ate the same thing every day: 70 grams of lean chicken and one small tomato. That's less than 150 calories. By comparison, a person my size burns about 2,500 calories a day. I also started exercising. I ran for at least an hour every morning, and I was in the gym for at least 2 hours every night. Yes, of course, I had great results. Within those 8 months, I lost 110 pounds. From 340 pounds, I went down to 230 pounds. I felt great and I looked very good. The goal was achieved. I lost the weight and I went back to my normal life. But although I was very active and always mindful of how much I eat, 2 years later I was 350 pounds. That way, every time I've lost weight, I was gaining it back with some more on top. After many years of diet and exercise, I managed to reach 440 pounds. Then I had my first signs of type 2 diabetes. I was constantly thirsty and hungry. I started peeing 20 times a day, and my vision got blurry. That terrified me because I knew what can happen if you live long enough with diabetes. I knew I could go blind. I knew I could lose my legs. It could be a stroke or a heart attack. Now, after I told you my story, you can clearly see that in those 20 years I've been following the advice and the ideas of camp number one. You can also see that I did exactly what is expected of me. After all, they believe that metabolic syndrome is incurable, progressive, and degenerative. And it is fact. I didn't cure myself. My condition was getting worse with each passing year, and in the end, I really felt damaged. But after I discovered there is another approach to metabolic syndrome, I decided that I should try it. In any case, the doctors from Camp 1 didn't give me any good offer. I had nothing to lose, and I decided to try to regulate my insulin and to reverse my insulin resistance. As you can already guess, now is time for the good news. I can safely say that I have great results. A year later, all the symptoms of diabetes are gone. All the symptoms of metabolic syndrome are greatly improved. I feel much better, and I also lost 40 kilos without limiting my calories and without exercising. And not that I didn't want to exercise, I was just too heavy to do it. So, at least for me, the answer to the question who's right is already clear. And not just for me, you can find a lot of stories similar to my one, as well as a lot of information in all low carb and keto sites. I will add links in the description to some of my favorite sources of information. I think now we're already good to answer the main question. What is metabolic syndrome? Metabolic syndrome is a slow and silent killer. It develops over years, and during the first 1 or 2 decades, it has no obvious symptoms. You don't feel bad, you don't feel anything wrong, and there is no reason for you and for your doctor to look for a problem. This is happening because our body adapts very well to slow changes. To better explain what I mean, I will use a classic example. If a child touches a hot stove, it will quickly learn that it's not a good idea to touch hot things. But if you let a child play in the hot sun, it will stay there until it gets sick. Well, metabolic syndrome works that way. Our body adapts to slow changes without alerting us, and we see the problem much later down the road when it's already too big to miss it. This is an essential part of evolution, and it is called adaptive physiology. The main driving force of metabolic syndrome is the vicious circle that forms between chronically high insulin and the insulin resistance of the body. The circle is vicious because the higher the insulin goes, the more insulin resistant our body becomes. And the more insulin resistant we become, the more insulin we have to produce to meet the need created by the insulin resistance. That way, hand in hand, they only go up and up until we are not able to produce enough insulin. This is the cornerstone of the syndrome. This vicious circle causes all the symptoms of metabolic syndrome. That's why just looking at the symptoms is not enough, because metabolic syndrome is not a condition that can be described with precise parameters. It is a condition that develops over time. It is a continuum. Metabolic syndrome continuum starts with normal insulin level and normal insulin sensitivity. It goes to the first stage, where there are no other symptoms than consistently increasing insulin and consistently increasing insulin resistance. The next stage is when the first symptoms appear, and when the symptoms become more than three is called metabolic syndrome or prediabetes. Then comes the stage of type 2 diabetes, where the body can no longer produce enough insulin to meet the need created by the insulin resistance. And in the last stage, metabolic syndrome and diabetes are working together, and they are the main cause of over 90% of all degenerative diseases. Finally, the continuum ends with death. This is metabolic syndrome. I know that now you probably have questions like what causes high insulin, what causes insulin resistance, what is the diet, but we will talk about all that in some of the next videos. Because the diet is specific, and insulin resistance and high insulin can be caused by different things and in different ways. And in order to understand how the diet works and why this vicious circle is formed, you need to know what is insulin, what is insulin resistance, and how metabolism works. So for now, let's keep the focus on metabolic syndrome and find the answer to the next question. Why more than half of the cases are not detected? Well, it is very easy to miss metabolic syndrome when it's in an early stage, especially if you're not looking for it. The standard medical practices don't include routine insulin check, and in the first 10-20 years there are no other symptoms than insulin. That's why they call metabolic syndrome slow and silent killer. Our body adapts easily to insulin resistance by simply producing more insulin to keep everything else normal. The second problem is created by all the definitions of the syndrome. The fact that you need to have 3 out of 5 symptoms means that until we have at least 3 of them, we do nothing else except to treat the symptoms. For example, if your blood pressure is higher than normal due to a metabolic syndrome, but you don't have other symptoms, the doctor will just prescribe you a medicine to lower down your blood pressure. Or if you gain weight because you have metabolic syndrome, but you don't have any other obvious symptoms, the doctor will tell you to lose weight, and so on and so on. It is a standard medical practice, and it is how all new doctors are trained around the world. And the third problem is that obesity has been wrongly accused for more than 50 years. The idea that metabolic syndrome and obesity are the same is deeply ingrained in medicine. Therefore, if you have symptoms of metabolic syndrome but you have normal weight, there is a high probability that you will be diagnosed with prediabetes, or simply to be told you have high blood pressure, high blood sugar, low HDL. As a result, we again get to the point where we only treat the symptoms, not the cause. But diagnosing the syndrome is only the first part of the problem. The standard practice for its treatment is no better. Over 80% of the doctors worldwide and most health organizations are still considering that metabolic syndrome is an incurable disease. And because it is considered to be incurable, it is also believed that the only thing we can do is to stop it or at least to slow it down. That way, even after a correct diagnosis, we again are treating just the symptoms, not the cause. And this brings us to the last question. Why and how does metabolic syndrome causes over 90% of all degenerative diseases? The fact that we are treating just the symptoms and not the real cause leads to serious problems. It is like trying to scoop the water out of a sinking boat without plugging the hole first. Sooner or later, the boat will sink. And here I've prepared a list of 8 of the most serious diseases caused by metabolic syndrome. Number 1 on the list is obesity. Obesity doesn't cause metabolic syndrome. The syndrome causes the obesity. Over 80% of overweight and obesity are due entirely to metabolic syndrome. To claim that obesity causes the syndrome is the same as claiming that high body temperature causes the heat stroke and not the fact you've been in the sun all day long. Number 2 on the list is type 2 diabetes. Over 90% of the cases of type 2 diabetes are due to metabolic syndrome. And diabetes, or more precisely, chronically high blood sugar, leads to very serious complications because blood sugar is toxic and damages the cells. That way, high blood sugar causes diabetic nephropathy. This is damaging of the nerve cells. And when the nerve cells are damaged, the brain can control the organs. So, nerve cells damage in the limbs is the main cause of amputations, especially leg amputations. Nerve cells damage in the eyes leads to vision loss. Nerve cells damage in the brain leads to dementia, Alzheimer's, and nerve cells damage in the joints leads to arthritis. The third place in the list is for the combination of metabolic syndrome and diabetes. Specifically, high blood sugar in combination with high blood pressure and high triglycerides. This combination damages the cardiovascular system and it is considered to be one of the main causes of cardiovascular diseases such as heart attack, stroke, atherosclerosis, and arrhythmia. The fourth place is taken by non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. The liver is the main organ of our metabolism. It processes and produces everything our body needs. The accumulation of fat in the liver leads to non-alcoholic cirrhosis. This is a liver breakdown. The statistics are terrifying because non-alcoholic fatty liver disease didn't exist 50 years ago and now is already the main cause of liver transplantation. The fifth place is for non-alcoholic fatty pancreas disease. Basically, the pancreas melts the same way the liver does. Number 6 on the list is for chronic kidney failure. High blood sugar and high blood pressure are damaging the blood vessels in the kidneys. And the kidneys are filtering the blood. So when the kidneys don't function well, we retain more toxins in the blood and this damages the whole body. About 80% of people on hemodialysis are in this condition because of metabolic syndrome. Metabolic syndrome also causes chronic inflammation in the body. Chronic inflammation overwhelms the immune system and makes us more susceptible to cancer and all the bacteria and viruses in the world. And the last problem on the list is that metabolic syndrome causes hormonal imbalance. Insulin is a master hormone, and when insulin is chronically high, it changes the levels of other hormones. Basically, chronically high insulin turns men into women and women into men. In men, chronically high insulin lowers testosterone and increases estrogen, which leads to the following problems: inability to maintain and build muscles, various sexual dysfunctions, infertility, and gynecomastia. the so-called man boobs. In women, chronically high insulin does the opposite. It increases testosterone and decreases estrogen. That leads to PCOS, polycystic ovary syndrome, which is expressed in infertility, various sexual dysfunctions, menstrual disorders, acne, hair loss, and excessive body hair. There are more diseases caused by metabolic syndrome, such as sleep disorders, skin problems, allergies, and depression. But I think the ones we have on the list are more than enough for now. The total chaos and all the complications that surround metabolic syndrome are preventing both doctors and people with metabolic syndrome from finding the right solution. And what's even more frightening is that the cases of metabolic syndrome are increasing with each passing year. Statistics are showing that if the cases continue to grow at the same rate until year 2050, more than 80% of the world population will have metabolic syndrome, and more than 30% will already have diabetes. The good news is that there is a solution to the problem, and that even after 20 years it is possible to reverse metabolic syndrome. The bad news is that all opinions and practices in the medical community are changing very slowly, especially when we already have an established model for treating a disease. No matter how much evidence you have, it is very difficult to change the current model. Disclaimers: I'm not a doctor. The content is for informational purposes only and does not constitute medical or other professional advice. I don't work for a food or medical company, and I do not receive funding from any industry. I don't like to use qualifiers like good, bad, healthy, and unhealthy because they can be subjective, misleading, and generalizing. I will try to keep my language as understandable as possible, and at the risk of not being extremely correct, I will try to explain biochemistry in layman's terms. That was all for now. Thank you very much for your time and attention. And if you are interested in the topics we discussed in this video, you can find more information on the YouTube channel of Project Metabolic Entanglement. Thanks again, and bye bye.